In Antarctica, scientists found DNA that exists in no database on Earth. They drilled for 22 years to reach it, through almost 4 kilometers of solid ice. In the coldest place on the surface of this planet, where the temperature drops to minus 89 degrees Celsius, where metal cracks like glass and the air you exhale freezes before it disappears. When they finally broke through, what they found inside that lake had been sealed from the outside world for 15 million years, completely isolated, cut off from everything living on the surface of this planet, evolving in total darkness, under pressure that would destroy any organism known to science. And what was alive down there did not match anything in any scientific database in the world. The researchers ran it through every classification system available, every global registry of known life forms. Nothing came back. The closest match was 86%, similar to anything known to science. In biological terms, that gap is not a difference. That is a wall. The lead scientist who analyzed the samples had one way to describe what they had found. He called it unclassified life. Within months, the results went quiet. The drilling stopped. The publication slowed to almost nothing, and Lake Vostok went back under the ice, exactly where it had been for 15 million years. This is the story of what they found, what they did with it, and why, more than a decade later, nobody has gone back. If this is your kind of thing, subscribe and drop a comment just right. Vostok. To understand what was found inside Lake Vostok, you first need to understand where it is and what it took to find it. Russia's Vostok station sits in the middle of East Antarctica. It is not a place designed for human comfort. It holds the absolute cold temperature record ever recorded on the surface of this planet. On February 21st, 1983, instruments at the station registered minus 89.2 degrees Celsius. That record has stood for more than 40 years. Nobody has come close to breaking it. At that temperature, fuel has to be kept running constantly, because engines that stop cannot be restarted. Exposed skin freezes in seconds. The moisture in your eyes begins to ice over. Working outside is measured in minutes, not hours. And yet, for decades, a rotating team of Russian scientists lived and worked at that station year-round, drilling slowly downward through the ice. The lake beneath them was not discovered through drilling. It was discovered from the air. In the 1970s, British and Soviet aircraft equipped with radar systems were mapping the Antarctic ice sheet when their instruments picked up something unexpected. The ice beneath Vostok Station was behaving differently. The radar signals were reflecting in a way that only happens over liquid water. Satellite radar confirmation came in the 1990s, and what it showed stopped the scientific world completely. Beneath almost 4 kilometers of ice, there was a lake. A freshwater lake the size of Lake Ontario, one of the largest lakes on the entire planet, hidden under the thickest part of the Antarctic ice sheet, completely unknown to science until that moment. The reaction from the scientific community was immediate. If liquid water existed under that much ice, under that much pressure, cut off from sunlight and atmosphere for millions of years, then the question that followed was unavoidable. Was anything living in it? The drilling that had already been underway for years took on a completely different meaning. The Russians were no longer just collecting ice cores for climate research. They were heading toward something that no human being had ever seen. And they had no idea what they were going to find when they got there. The decision to drill all the way down to Lake Vostok was not made quickly. It was not the result of a single meeting or a single moment of scientific ambition. It was the product of decades of slow, grinding, almost invisible work, carried out by people who understood that what they were trying to reach might take their entire careers to get to. And for many of them, it did. The Soviet Union began drilling at Vostok Station in 1970. The original goal had nothing to do with the lake. The scientists were extracting ice cores, cylindrical samples of compressed ice that function like a natural archive of the Earth's climate history. Each layer of ice corresponds to a specific period in time. The deeper you go, the further back you read. At Vostok, the ice goes back more than 400,000 years, covering 4 complete glacial cycles. It is one of the most valuable climate records ever recovered from anywhere on this planet. But as the drill went deeper, something changed. The readings from the equipment began to behave in ways that did not match the expected profile of solid ice. There were anomalies, inconsistencies, signals that the scientists could not immediately explain. It took years of analysis, cross-referenced with the aerial radar data from the 1970s and the satellite confirmation from the 1990s before the full picture became clear. They were not just drilling through ice, they were drilling toward a lake. And that realization transformed everything about the project. The scientific community around the world understood immediately what it meant. A body of liquid water sealed beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice, isolated from the atmosphere for 15 million years, existing under pressure roughly 400 times greater than standard atmospheric pressure at sea level. The conditions inside that lake were unlike anything scientists had ever had direct access to on Earth. The drilling continued, but now it moved with a different kind of weight behind it. Every meter downward was a meter closer to something that had never been touched, never been seen, never been contaminated by any contact with the surface world. The team working at Vostok Station knew that what they were approaching was irreplaceable, that the moment they broke through, whatever was inside that lake would be exposed to the outside world for the first time in 15 million years. There was no going back from that moment. There was no second chance to do it right. The engineering challenges were enormous. Drilling through ice at that depth generates heat from friction, which causes the borehole to close back in on itself. To prevent that, the team used a drilling fluid, a mixture of kerosene and freon, to keep the hole open and lubricated. That decision would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire project, because the same fluid that made the drilling possible also raised serious questions about contamination of the lake water itself. International scientific bodies debated the approach for years. Some argued that the risk of contaminating a 15-million-year-old sealed ecosystem with drilling fluid was too high, that the scientific value of what might be inside the lake would be destroyed the moment foreign chemicals touched it. Others argued that the technology available at the time gave them no alternative, and that waiting for better methods would mean waiting indefinitely. The Russians kept drilling. In January 1998, with the drill approaching what was estimated to be the final stretch before reaching the lake surface, an international agreement was reached to halt the drilling temporarily. The decision came from pressure by environmental and scientific groups who wanted stricter protocols in place before the lake was penetrated. The halt lasted years. The equipment sat idle at one of the most remote and hostile research stations on Earth, while scientists and institutions argued about the right way to proceed. When drilling resumed, it did so under new guidelines and with new equipment designed to minimize contamination risk. The final approach to the lake surface took years more, centimeter by centimeter. Through ice that had taken millions of years to accumulate, the drill moved downward. On February 5, 2012, after 22 years of drilling, the bit broke through the final meters of ice and reached the surface of Lake Vostok. The pressurized lake water rose immediately into the borehole and froze, exactly as the team had predicted, exactly as the protocols required. The contamination risk had been anticipated and managed. The samples were collected. The borehole was sealed. The entire scientific world was watching. And what happened next was not what anyone had expected. The first results from the Lake Vostok samples were published in 2013. The scientific paper came from a team at Bowling Green State University in the United States, led by researcher Scott Rogers. They had analyzed the ice cores collected from just above the lake surface, the frozen lake water that had risen into the borehole at the moment of penetration. What they found inside those samples was described in the paper as a diverse set of sequences from aquatic, marine, and sediment-inhabiting bacteria and eukarya. That is the scientific language. What it means in plain terms is this: the samples contained DNA from more than 3,500 distinct organisms in a lake that the scientific consensus had assumed might be completely sterile. There were thousands of different life forms present. The diversity of what they found was not what anyone had predicted, but the number was not the part that stopped people. What stopped people was something else entirely, something that came not from the American team, but from the Russian scientists, who had been analyzing their own samples taken directly from the lake water itself, rather than from the ice above it. Sergei Bulat, a microbiologist at the St. Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute, had been running the Russian samples through every classification database available. His team compared the genetic sequences they had extracted against the most comprehensive global registries of known life forms in existence. They ran the comparisons multiple times. They checked for contamination. They verified their methodology. And every time, they got the same result: no match. The DNA they had extracted from Lake Vostok water did not correspond to anything in any database on Earth. The closest similarity they could find to any known organism was 86%. In the language of biology, that number is not a small gap. When scientists classify a new species, they are typically working with genetic similarities above 97%. A similarity of 86% does not place something in an unknown branch of a known family tree. It places it outside the tree entirely. Bulat chose his words carefully when he spoke to the press. He said that after excluding all known contaminants, his team had discovered bacterial DNA that does not match any known species listed in global databanks. He called it unidentified and unclassified life. Those words were picked up by science journalists around the world. For a few days, the story was everywhere. Russian scientists had found something living in a 15-million-year-old sealed lake beneath Antarctica, and that something did not match any known form of life on Earth. And then, almost as quickly as it had appeared, the story disappeared. The follow-up publications that the scientific world expected never came. Bulat's team did not release a full technical report on the unclassified organism. The Russian Institute did not organize an international scientific conference to present the findings. The requests from other research groups to access the raw data were not publicly answered. The official position that emerged from Russian scientific institutions in the months that followed was cautious to the point of being almost meaningless. The samples had shown interesting biological signals. Further analysis was required. Results would be published when the work was complete. That statement was made in 2013. It has never been substantially updated. At the same time that Bulat's team was working with the Russian samples, the American team at Bowling Green was publishing its own results. Their findings of more than 3,500 DNA sequences generated significant scientific interest, but also significant criticism. Several researchers raised concerns about contamination. The drilling fluid used to keep the borehole open, the mixture of kerosene and freon, had been in contact with the equipment for years. If any of that fluid had reached the lake water, The biological signals in the samples could reflect surface organisms introduced by the drilling process rather than life forms native to the lake. Scott Rogers, the lead author of the American study, pushed back against those concerns directly. His team had taken extensive precautions against contamination and had designed the study specifically to account for that risk. The wide diversity of organisms detected and the fact that more sequences were found in samples taken closer to the lake surface than in samples from higher up in the ice was consistent with what a real subglacial ecosystem would look like, not with a contamination pattern. The scientific debate about contamination versus genuine discovery has never been formally resolved. No independent team has been given access to equivalent samples to run a parallel analysis. The borehole at Vostok Station has not been reopened for a second sampling mission, and the unclassified organism that Bulat's team described, the one with 86% similarity to anything known, the one he called unclassified life, has never been the subject of a published peer-reviewed paper that would allow the rest of the scientific world to examine the data, challenge the methodology, or confirm the finding. It exists in press statements, in interviews, in a few lines from a scientist at a nuclear physics institute in St. Petersburg, who said what he found and then, for reasons that have never been explained, said very little more. The lake is still there. The samples still exist somewhere in Russian laboratories. The data is still sitting in computers at the St. Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute. And the question that Bulat raised in 2013 has never received a scientific answer. What exactly was that organism? Where did it come from? How did it get there? And why, in the 13 years since it was found, has no one published the full results of what was arguably the most significant biological discovery of the 21st century? When a scientific discovery of this magnitude is made, the protocol is clear. You publish the full data. You invite independent teams to verify the results. You go back and take more samples. You build on what you found. None of that happened with Lake Vostok. The drilling stopped in 2012 and has not resumed. The borehole was sealed. The station continued operating as a climate research facility, but the project that had defined it for decades, the project that had just produced what may be the most significant biological finding in modern science, was quietly set aside. No international team has been granted access to the lake. No second sampling mission has been announced. No independent laboratory has been given the Russian samples to run a parallel analysis. The data that Sergei Bulat described in his press statements, the genetic sequences that matched nothing in any database on Earth, has never appeared in a full published scientific paper. 13 years have passed. The official explanation from Russian scientific institutions has been consistent. The samples require further analysis. The results will be published when the work is complete. Contamination risks need to be fully assessed before any new drilling takes place. Those are reasonable things to say. They are also the kind of things you say when you want to keep a door closed without appearing to lock it. Because here is what makes the silence at Vostok different from ordinary scientific caution. In the same year that the Russians penetrated Lake Vostok, an American team drilled into a different subglacial lake in West Antarctica, Lake Willans. They also found life. Their results were published within months. The data was shared. Independent teams were invited to verify the findings. The scientific process worked exactly the way it is supposed to work. Same continent, same year, same type of discovery. One team published everything immediately. The other team went quiet and has stayed quiet for 13 years. That difference has never been explained. There is something else that rarely gets mentioned in discussions about Lake Vostok. The lake does not sit alone under the ice. Antarctica has more than 400 known subglacial lakes. They are connected by a network of rivers and channels that flow beneath the ice sheet, carrying water, sediment, and potentially biological material from one lake to another. Lake Vostok is the largest of them, but it is part of a system that covers an entire continent and that science has barely begun to map. Whatever is living in Lake Vostok may not be living only in Lake Vostok, and that possibility, more than any single finding from the 2012 drilling, may be the real reason why the door has stayed closed. Because opening it fully does not just mean answering a question about one lake. It means opening a question about an entire hidden world beneath the Antarctic ice sheet that nobody has authorization, resources, or perhaps willingness to answer right now. The borehole at Vostok Station is still there, sealed, waiting. The equipment that drilled it for 22 years is still at the station. The samples are still in Russian laboratories. And the organism that Bulat called unclassified life is still sitting in a database somewhere in St. Petersburg, waiting for someone to decide that the world is ready to know what it is. That decision has not been made yet. The drilling stopped in 2012 and has never resumed. The borehole was sealed. The samples went into Russian laboratories, and the organism that Bulat called unclassified life has never been the subject of a full published scientific paper. 13 years have passed. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about what is living under the Antarctic ice sheet. We have mapped the bottom of every ocean on this planet, while leaving a sealed lake beneath our own continent unexamined for over a decade. Antarctica is officially a territory dedicated to peaceful science, open to research, transparent by international agreement, and yet the most significant biological finding made there in the last century sits unpublished in a freezer in St. Petersburg with no explanation, no follow-up mission, and no date announced for when any of that might change. The lake is still there. Whatever is living inside it has been waiting for 15 million years. It can wait a little longer. The question is whether we can. If you're into this, subscribe and drop a comment. Just write